To day 2 of Dark and Dangerous Thoughts. This morning we are starting with internet trolls. It is, and just angry white men in general. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Hamish Macdonald. I'm blanking here now. Shannon Burns and Ginger Gorman. Ginger will be signing books at the end of the session at the bookshop outside. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Hope you've had a good morning here in lovely Hobart. The conversation this morning is called The Lost Boys, Who Are the Men Who Fall Through the Cracks. You probably know the people that are in front of you anyway, but in case you don't, Shannon Burns is an Australian writer of fiction, essay and review. His work can be found in Best Australian Essays 2017, Mianjin, the Monthly, Australian Book Review, the list goes on. In 2009, he was awarded the Adelaide Review Prize for short fiction. And Ginger Gorman is a social justice journalist based in Canberra. Her first-hand experience of online hate compelled her to enter the world of internet trolls. She's now in demand as an expert on online hate and social media. She recently published the book, Troll Hunting. Would you please welcome Shannon and Ginger? There will be questions at the end. We'll try and leave plenty of time for that, and you can send them via text, but I'll take care of the questions for now. Shannon, can I start with you? Growing up in North Adelaide, I think in the 1980s, what did a lost boy look like in that place at that time?
Well, it's not North Adelaide, it's the northern suburbs of Adelaide. So North Adelaide's quite a posh place.
Right.
But the outer northern suburbs of Adelaide, a lost boy was someone who was trending toward the criminal class. And there were lots of those around. It was a viable social group and a viable trajectory that you could join. And that would just be a kind of recycled, gradually increased intensity, sort of moving into the criminal class. And when I was a kid, I definitely experimented with some criminal activities when I was very young. I don't know, it was like a game to try and break into places and to take trophies and things like that. So I'm talking about, when I was pre-10 years old. So that kind of lost boy is a familiar figure for me.
And what sort of homes did they come from, the types of kids you're talking about?
Usually erratic homes. So there's usually their parents had some similar experience in the criminal world. It's interesting because for me, I mostly saw people who had more erratic childhoods than mine, even though mine was pretty erratic. I lived in lots of different places and was in institutional care and was very unsettled. But it was clear to me that there were lots of other, not just boys, girls as well, who had a kind of path set out for them. And it was a pretty clear path, and the clarity of that path does make it inviting.
Were they all white kids, or were the lost boys different?
It was pretty mixed, actually. So in some of the places that I grew up, there was a large migrant population, and there was definitely cross-hatching of a criminal trajectory there. And in other places, at times my friends were Indigenous kids, and there was a kind of clear path for us. Actually, I was regarded as a bad influence on some of my
Really?
Aboriginal friends. Yeah.
Why?
Well, because the ones that I happened to be involved with were reasonably functional. They were doing well. So the first man I knew who wore a tie and went to work was an Aboriginal man, and he was great. And his son was a close friend of mine, and he sort of took me under his wing. And I, to pay them back, I showed their son how to break into into various places.
Right. Ginger, you obviously have met and come to know quite a number of trolls. Presumably, the majority of them are not necessarily in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. But does this sort of description of Lost Boys ring true for you in the troll context?
Yeah, it was funny reading Shannon's excellent essay. If you haven't read it, you should go and read it. But the boys in that you describe and the way you describe your childhood is very, very similar. I mean, a lot of the trolls, so some of the trolls I formed very deep, long relationships with were Australian, but a lot of them were from the States, but from really violent, damaged homes usually, and completely unparented. So one of the big revelations to me, so just to be clear, these guys are what I would call predator trolls. So they are using the internet to do real life harm. So they're doing psychological harm, physical harm, or both. And this kind of trolling is linked to terrorism and murder and domestic violence, all kinds of other things. So these kids, a lot of them when I was talking to them are in their early 20s, but they all had this really similar story, which was that they had been completely unparented and left alone online. And so from about 10, they're sat there on the internet kind of imbibing these really extreme ideologies on platforms like Reddit and Tumblr and 4chan and 8chan, so the cesspits of the internet. And that's how they're parented. So they're imbibing misogyny, white supremacy, all this stuff. And no one is there at all. And it's really unsurprising to me then that they go on to do what are essentially crimes. So perhaps in your childhood they were real life crimes where you're breaking into buildings. This is like sort of inciting terrorism online and things like that.
So if they're lost boys and they find this space on the internet, are they still lost or have they actually found a place?
I mean, it's hard to answer that. I had so many conversations with them about that, and one of them said to me, you know, if you are angry with the world and you feel alone and you feel this hatred and then you find a bunch of other people who you think are the same and you want to go out and damage the world, you do feel like you found your cohort, except you're still kind of lost, you know. He said he said we are, what did he use? He said we have grown up in emotional poverty. And I think there's one particular troll who I became really good friends with, who is president of an international syndicate, and he's like my hate match. He's a white.
You don't call him his troll wife.
My husband, my actual husband, called him my troll husband because I spent so much time with him. And that book wouldn't exist without him because it's a different universe. It's like, the way I describe it to people is it's like bikie gangs. There's these big syndicates, they have presidents and vice presidents, and they all know each other and they do these raids, and it's a very sophisticated culture and you cannot understand it from the outside. So yeah, he gave me a lot of insight into that, and incredibly bright, that's the other thing. So I don't know whether this rings true with some of your cohort, but these guys were insanely bright, a lot of them, and you know, the ideas that we have that they are stupid and that they don't know what they're doing and that it's an accident that they're damaging people, it's not at all. It was very organised, and a lot of that is frustration, I think. I mean, I don't know about your cohort, but a lot of these guys are super smart, which wasn't at all what I thought going in, you know?
Yeah, smart in different ways for me, but yeah, across different environments, different kinds of intelligence. The strange experience for me has been to see a lot of those people who I grew up with who were natively extremely intelligent and who are capable of engaging with things analytically and really strong with rhetoric and all of those sorts of things, how they just sort of slip away into their own worlds.
Do they die? Because a lot of the guys these guys, like while I was writing my book, they died because they are so damaged, they take a lot of drugs, they're engaging in extremely risky behaviours.
Not so much death for me. I don't know, I was a teenager through the 90s. There was a fair bit of suicide around, but I haven't seen the later trajectory of those guys. I extracted myself, so I don't really have a sense of where they all ended up.
Yeah.
Shannon, you've written about your own personal experience of violence as a kid. I don't know if you are willing to share that with us this morning, but I'm interested to understand how you think, in retrospect, that impacted your behaviour subsequently.
Well, in lots of different ways. So one of the things probably is that I'm more comfortable with violence than a lot of people, even though I'm sort of anti-violent. But there's not for me, it's not I feel like if the world became more violent, I could adapt to it. When I was a kid...
How do you mean?
Well, when I was a kid, if my mother brought strange men home, my way of greeting them would be to hit them. And that was that was the way that I expressed myself when I was very young. And that happened. That didn't really last into my teenage years. But that was there organically, and I always felt very comfortable with that kind of physicality. And so I think a trace of that is still there. The great thing is sports. You get that out. If you participate in sport, you don't have to hit people when you greet them. So my sense of violence, and then that was more of my mother was very violent, so she hit me quite a lot. Seemed normal, but I have memories of waking up on like a concrete floor in the laundry with sort of blood. I don't know. The memories are unreliable. You don't know exactly.
Do you know what age you were?
Yeah, this would be under 5. So things like that were common to me. And then, at some point I turned away from it. I think it was part of being in or taking on a language-rich persona. That sort of transitions you socially. You think in different ways, you engage in different ways. But I know that when I was like in my mid to late teens, and I was going through my political phase, which was a very left-wing, radical political phase, and I was reading about, Che Guevara, and I was reading about Robespierre and the French. I was not unsettled by Robespierre cutting off all those heads at all. I wasn't even slightly unsettled by that. And so all of that revolutionary violence, that was something that I could incorporate. And I do think that if there had been a viable sort of internet culture which invited me to be a violent leftist revolutionary, that I could easily have been funneled into that.
I can introduce you to those guys.
Yeah, no, I find them creepy now and silly, but yeah.
In that context, what thoughts went through your head when 9/11 happened? That was a very violent moment. Yeah. No, so this is a shocking and shameful thing. But, I was anti-American imperialist at that time. And the thought that I had, I didn't really express it, but I remember it, is that on some level they deserved that, which is a very callous kind of a thought. And while people are jumping to their deaths out of windows, and these buildings are in flames and falling down, one of my real genuine thoughts was that there's some responsibility that those people carry for what their country has done. Therefore, on some level, they deserve it. I think is abhorrent, but it's possible to have that mindset. So Ginger, as Shannon said, he didn't give voice to it. It was a thought. If someone does have a space, whether it's IRL in real life or whether it is online, to find other people that might share some of those thoughts, how does that change the process? How does that activate the thought?
I mean, one of the things you hear people say is the internet's to blame for this, which I find absolutely ludicrous. Like I heard Malcolm Turnbull speak at Parliament House at Safer Internet Day last year when he was still Prime Minister. And he stood up, he was actually quoting Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and he sort of said, the internet is to blame for the level of discourse. And I was like, dude, have you seen yourself in Parliament lately? It's ridiculous to think that the tool caused the behaviour. Sometimes tools, though, insist on being used in certain ways. So the attitudes are there anyway in these guys, but they can find each other. And they also magnify the views. So you see...
But if in his case, in Shannon's case, there was no way in which he could find other people that shared that thought, isn't it the internet that actually
Well,
has given that thought some kind of carriage?
He was still acting out the violence, but what happens with these guys is you see them magnify. So, for example, the Christchurch killer, he was a predator troll, and I've looked really closely at what he was doing on 8chan beforehand, and he was in these exact white supremacist cohorts, and they were all egging him on. So when he was saying, I'm going to, I'm going to do this massacre, his cohort of white supremacists were saying, good, great, go for it, brother. Like, we're going to be watching, we're going to be laughing with you. And so, yes, in the sense, like, I think he would have done that anyway. But the fact that he had an audience and a cohort did magnify that behaviour and did exacerbate it. But it didn't cause the behaviour. I mean, you can't say that white supremacy and misogyny and those things, it didn't exist before the internet. Sadists have always existed. So, the research is that trolls are sadists. But they do definitely find each other, they do magnify their ideas, and it does become very much like a contagion. So like the Salem witch trials where they're egging each other on. And that is not, by the way, Christchurch, everyone was like, oh my God, Christchurch, this has never happened before online. There's a high school shooter at the very start of my book. He did a very similar thing. It's on a much smaller level, but the circumstances were very similar. He was telling his cohort beforehand, they were egging him on. So yes, it is a radicalisation kind of hotbed, but the Nazis exist before the Holocaust.
Sure.
The Holocaust exists before the internet, sorry. So, we can't say that the internet caused it, but I think the tool does create an environment where those things are more likely to happen.
Does it sort of inflame whatever the thought is?
I think it's got very powerful potential for magnification, and proliferation. That's the difference. That it's much harder to spread an idea in a society that doesn't have that environment. But, we had the Salem witch trials in the 1600s. These are very similar things that are happening online now.
Yeah, so I've instinctively always felt that social media is a terrible idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think I know that if it was there when I was a young man, that I would have regrets. Because I definitely had this capacity to escalate. And I've always been pretty good at identifying a weak point. I don't do it. I've disciplined myself not to do it now, but that was something that I was pretty good at. And so when challenged, it was always possible for me to humiliate a little too well and a little too cruelly. But I was taught that, there was this kind of school of that. I remember part of my family's Greek. I had Greek uncles, and the eldest one was a very steady guy, and the middle uncle was a bit more erratic, and so the elder uncle would say, Shannon, go and call him a wog, or a dirty wog, or something like that. And so I would wander off and do that, and he would get angry, and then my older uncle would stand up and say, what are you going to do about it? So there's this sort of training in abuse and handling abuse that goes on there. If you're someone who isn't good at handling abuse, you'll get abused more just as a kind of way of training you to be able to handle abuse. Now, if you have that ethos and then you apply it across into a larger context, you've got very different sensibilities at play there.
But you can't blame the internet for, you're blaming the tool. The tool also has only existed for a short time, so we don't really know how to interact with it. But I think it's quite dangerous to say that, the internet is to blame, the internet, and that social media is bad, because social media has huge positive effects as well. Like in an emergency or a flood, like I've worked for ABC Emergency, you see how fast you can get the information out on social media, you see how fast people help each other. So you don't want to, can the tool because of human failings.
No. So I think that's obviously true, that with any technological advancement, especially around interconnectedness, there's going to be great positives and great negatives.
And at the moment, it is, I agree that it does seem that the negatives can outweigh the positives a lot of the time. But you see incredible situations where humanity comes together and we share knowledge and we, have this great interconnectedness through social media. So I'm just loath when people say social media is to blame,
But there is this other thing that we do, I think, fairly naturally as humans. We have this strong narrative that we build up about other people. We don't really know details about other people, but we compulsively have a story about other people.
Yes.
And social media invites that, I think, the sort of mechanical treatment of people as our story of them in our head. We just apply it out there in the world. When we're around people in a more human way, we see that our stories don't match up.
Yeah, and there's a really important thing that happens on the internet. The academic name of it is called the online disinhibition effect. But what it really means is I can't see you, I'm not smiling at you or nodding at you, I can't see that I'm hurting you, and therefore it's kind of gamified, so I can say whatever I want. So people will say to me, I'm going to cut your uterus out and kill your kids online. No one would ever say that to me in the supermarket. They wouldn't.
They do online, do they?
They do online, yeah. And one of the things I've been doing to because there's no social norms online. So the father of the internet, Vint Cerf, he's the guy that created the internet, one of them, he was saying, this is a problem, that there's no social norms online, and we've got to basically impress them online because the internet's only existed since 1996. And so one of the things I've started doing, which actually works, so Lisa Miller, ABC personality, she was presenting on Breakfast, and this guy...
She'll love that you're calling her a personality.
She's a journalist, a former Europe correspondent for the ABC. She's fabulous. She was filling in for Virginia Trolley on Breakfast, and then you got some random guy, it's always like a random old white guy, right, saying, you just talk shit for hours and whatever. It was just kind of random abuse. And I just tweeted him and said, hey, Peter, Lisa is the most lovely, hardworking person. Would you say that to her in the supermarket? He completely shut up. And then the other thing that happened is I'm all into magnification, so like making people bigger who are getting abused online. So then everyone started retweeting her and making her bigger, and all that abuse stopped. So the kind of the implementation of social norms can be quite powerful, I think, as a corrective way to stop that.
So if we're sort of accepting that lost boys today might go and join ISIS or might go and join a white nationalist group online, they could potentially become a member of a street gang in a city in Australia. They might also join a CrossFit gym.
Yeah.
What connects them? What connects all of these people in your views?
To me, they're really disenfranchised. It was really shocking to me as a kind of a white left-wing feminist to come to this, but I was sort of embedded with them, and the weird thing about these guys is, so I went out trying to find predator trolls, and I thought that nobody would want to talk to me because, if you're asking people to talk about these terrible behaviours, usually they don't want to talk to you, and as a journalist, it's very hard. But these guys, once I started talking to them, they never shut up, right? They'd be on my apps 24 hours a day, ping, 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 ping. And I'd have to delete the app sometimes. And then I was like, why do they want to talk to me, And I actually realised they're marginalised. These young white men who, in my head, had been like upholding the patriarchy and, kind of oppressing women, in their heads, they actually feel, and I believe that they are, marginalised. These are not wealthy, educated white men with all these opportunities. These are guys from essentially, in shorthand, white trash families who've had very difficult upbringings, and they're lost. They're angry and they feel swept aside, and I think they are. So all these guys that you're talking about, that's what I think connects them.
Do you think that too, Shannon?
Yeah, I think it's plausible. There's been a kind of generalist approach to the white male, which is reasonable in some context of sort of diminishing their status, but it's been generalist. It hasn't been about white men positioned in a certain way. The way that it plays out is
so the white male privilege idea is too broad. Is that what you're saying?
If you find that you are really low in the social hierarchy, if you feel like you have little status, you're not socially connected, there's no good future for you, everything is quite precarious, but you're also symbolically bad.
Yeah.
That can be just that little extra tweak that takes that can produce the kind of hostility that we see.
And I do think, like, one of them, I couldn't understand why they all love Jordan Peterson. You know, they love Jordan Peterson. I know he was at this festival last year. They love Donald Trump as well. And then Meep Sheep, this is my troll husband, he said, can you imagine if you got up every day and you were made to be part of rape culture just by virtue of being white and having a penis? Like, how would you feel? Which is what really far-left feminism does to white men. And I did have a moment of going, yeah, that's garbage, you know? And the idea that Coleman yesterday was talking about all black people and the way they're cast in America, like 40% of black people think this. They're not one cohort. White men are not one cohort, which I guess is what I came to in the end. These guys actually, as much as it makes my skin itchy, kind of being a left-wing feminist, they are marginalised and they are not heard. And they're the same guys that voted Donald Trump in, you know, and the media was shocked because they weren't talking to those people. The New York Times, the Washington Post wasn't talking to those people. They are kind of like mute.
Yeah, see, I find this challenging because I do have a masculinist impulse, right? And and so I'm not going to. I don't want to talk about male vulnerability. That's not the narrative that I instinctively choose.
Isn't that interesting?
But that, and so there's this philosopher who I find really funny. He's an antinatalist philosopher, and I like him as a sort of utilitarian. I find him funny because he makes really good arguments. They're soberly constructed, and they seem to arrive at absurd conclusions. So an antinatalist is that no one should have babies. He has also written this book called The Second Sexism, which basically is just a really well done version of MRA talking points. And it took me about 2 years to read it, cringing the whole way through. It wasn't as enjoyable as the antinatalism. The antinatalism is funny. The talking about various forms of marginalised of injustice towards men and all those sorts of things is hard. It's very hard to embrace. That makes it tricky because there's only one other way of doing it. So my personal approach is to, if I don't feel like I'm wanted in a space, I'll find another space. I think that other people will, who don't have access to that or aren't instinctively driven to do that, and who can't talk about their vulnerability, will revert to hostility.
So they'll stay in that space.
They'll stay in that space and be hostile, yeah.
But there's a real power in being heard, which, you know, you kind of know as a journalist. But so when the book came out, Mark, who's a psychopath, right? He incites people to suicide. He's a very serious predator troll. And there's something missing, so he has no human empathy whatsoever. And he threatens me, and he would threaten to send me dick pics and threaten to fuck up my life and all sorts of things. I can't get out of that relationship. I sent him one of the first copies of the book, and then he wrote back to me and said, this is a really good book. And I think it's because, and a few of them have done that, and I was like, what is this about? And how should I feel about this? But the thing is, they feel represented, they feel heard, and so they're proud of having a voice.
So do they, in your view, and this is not just about trolls, but broadly this idea of lost boys, do they deserve more of our sympathy?
Well, if you think about those little kids that are left alone online from the time they're 10 and no one's hugging or kissing them or explaining to them or even feeding them, like one of them was starved, his parents were not there at all. You know, are you surprised that they turn out as predator trolls and they want to hurt us? I mean, these are children of our community. We are all responsible for that. That's a parenting story, you know, and we can fix that. So in a sense, yes, like I mean, people are very angry that I have this relationship with Meep Sheep. And they're like, how could you do that? But, you know, where's our humanity in all of this? Like, we are not going to solve hatred with hatred. I think we have to bring our greatest humanity to this, yes.
But it's one thing to do that with a troll. It's another thing to do that with someone that's returning from fighting jihad in the Middle East.
But how are you gonna change it? Because, you know, like one of the guys in my book was an incel when I met him. Do you know what that is? Yeah. So he hated women and he believed...
You might want to just explain.
Yeah,
I suspect
will.
not everyone knows what that is.
An incel is, it's short for involuntary celibate, and they are these sort of festering chat rooms full of angry young white men that think that women should be raped and punched, and, you know, they're attracted to women but they hate them and they want sex from them. So he was an incel when I met him, and then a year later, he actually thanked me for, you know, being in conversation with him for a year and said I no longer hate women. And I told this story on the ABC, but you know, he said he'd started dating a woman, and I was like, oh, lucky her. But anyway, but the thing that I'm trying to say here is, like, after a year of normal human contact with me, and I think I'm a fairly empathetic, open-hearted person, and I went in with kind of radical empathy, listening and hearing, he changed. He wasn't the same person at all. And his language changed, and he would ask me how I was, and he cared about that because I'd cared about him. So, yes, I'm all about radical empathy. I've been criticised for it because I went in really listening and trying to understand where they were coming from, and some feminists wrote to me and said, how dare you kind of engage with the perpetrators in that way? But what else are you going to do? Like, are you going to solve it with hatred? I don't know.
No, this is sort of interesting to me because these problems have been around for a long time in one form or another, and one of the great, I think still the unparalleled thinker around around this sort of thing is a Russian guy called Fyodor Dostoevsky, and he wrote. And so you're talking about people who have done monstrous things, and can they be welcomed back into the community, and how can you engage with them? Dostoevsky was someone who could put people who did monstrous things onto a sort of dramatic stage, see them interact with each other, and the process of that was naturally humanising. So Raskolnikov murders this Jewish woman, and he does it because he's very marginalised, very socially isolated. His prospects seem to be diminishing. He's disconnected from his real community, yet he has this expectation for himself that he'll achieve something. So his version of that is killing someone, going outside the natural order. But we see in each of those cases the reasons why it happened, and in each of those cases there is always a way back.
So how might that work in
today's
Australia? I mean, you're not going to put the sort of street gangs on a stage with the
no.
returning jihadists.
Well, the cliche in fiction is that there will be a woman who dedicates herself to to understanding these men, and by constantly being there and attempting to draw out their better selves.
And what happens to her?
No, she usually, sometimes she doesn't fare well, but usually in fiction it goes okay.
Right.
But also, there's a kind of idea, like there's two reactions to my relationship with Meep. One is that I just can't understand that, what the fuck are you doing with, you know, and a lot of my friends are like that too. The other one is, aren't you amazing? As if I'm some kind of martyr for having that relationship with him. But he is more incredible than me in the sense of, like, he was brought up in a violent, difficult home. His mother was a violent alcoholic, and that's why he was a misogynist. So it was actually much braver of him to have the relationship with me than, I mean, I'm a journalist, I'm trained to listen. And the thing is, I learned just as much from him. Like, it totally changed my worldview about all kinds of things.
Sure.
So it's not just about us trying to rehabilitate those people, whoever they are, and the heinous things that they've done. Yeah, like you've spent time with jihadis and radicals. It's actually quite transformative in terms of thinking in a completely different way. And this is part of the problem with social media and the discourse in general, is that we're so polarised. We are absolutely refusing to have radical empathy and really open our ears and eyes and hearts and listen to other people that are genuinely different. Someone that is doing great damage to the community has profound things to tell us.
Shannon, if we accept that there is some commonality between these different groups of lost boys,
Very different groups, yes.
and if we accept the idea that radical empathy can work, is it applicable, do you think, to the full spectrum here? I mean, if you think about the sort of the base politics of it, if you had a Home Affairs minister turning around and saying, I don't want to demonise African street gangs in Melbourne, I want to hug them.
Yeah.
Or, a foreign minister saying, well, of course we'll go and collect the ISIS fighters from Syria and bring them home and celebrate them and reintegrate them into Australian society. That would be very difficult and hard for many Australians to accept.
Oh yeah, I don't think it would work that way. That's the job of spiritual types, and that has been their function in communities for a long time. There's a difference between maintaining people in a kind of community of man versus giving them free rein in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a tendency, if people do grotesque things, or even if they do slight things, to a desire to excommunicate them completely. But I think that we don't need to do that. So in Dostoevsky, they're always punished and they get sent to Siberia. They spend a long time away from the community, but they are still part of the common brotherhood of man.
So where are those spiritual types now?
Oh no, I think that's probably one of the deficits. I think that's why someone like Jordan Peterson is
he's got such a big...
is
And
embraced.
I am not trying to say that you shouldn't hold people that do terrible things to account. Like, I did listen and I did have an open heart and open mind, but I still ask the hard questions. Like, you can't kill somebody and not be accountable for it. Someone like Mark, there are dead people because of him, and he is still walking among us, and that is not okay.
Could you imagine doing some of this stuff, building these relationships? Because, you've talked about the anger that you've received for forming these relationships with some of these guys.
And don't forget that my family and my children were threatened.
Yeah.
Like, we were very, very scared, and we had no help at all from the ABC, from the police, from anybody.
Could you imagine doing that, say, with some young jihadists?
Yeah, 100%, because they're lost too.
But would you feel differently about the threats?
No, in fact, I feel more scared about white supremacists because the statistics are that white supremacists are killing far more people than Islamic extremists around the world currently, and nobody is watching them. Like, when the Christchurch killing happened, I had actually been to Facebook 9 months earlier and said, this is a dangerous product, people are going to get killed. They already are on very similar products, and they said, no, it's safe. Anyway, besides that, hang on, I've lost my train of thought now. The police are not watching white supremacists, and the politicians aren't watching them. And the reason for that is because our politicians, Trump, Scott Morrison, Peter Dutton, they have been using thinly veiled white supremacist ideologies for a long time. And, there are quotes, I've quoted them in the last 10 years saying those things. So they've been saying, we should watch out for Muslims in our communities and things like that. They have both said in party room meetings and things similar sentiments, right?
I have to point out Scott Morrison denies that he ever said that.
Yeah, okay. But basically there is a thinly veiled white supremacist rhetoric, which means that nobody is watching those guys. The boards where this was happening, the Christchurch killing stuff, and also this other guy, high school shooter, and many others. It's all, I'm not a techie person, it's not on the dark web, it's everywhere. The police are not watching those places, but they would be if they were Islamic. So there's actually a kind of racism in our ability to deal with radicalisation. So I am more terrified. Like, the Christchurch killings were just coming. I've been talking about this for 5 years, that it was going to happen. And it will happen again because nobody's watching those. And the police came out and said after Christchurch killings, we had no idea. And the same with this Aztec high school shooting. We had no idea. How did you have no idea? It's on 8chan.
Shannon, on the question of sympathy for lost boys, you're the father of 2 sons.
Yeah.
Tell me about why your eldest son has quite radically reshaped the way you're thinking about some of this stuff.
Yeah, so first of all, I had no concern with boys at all up until I had boys. And I wasn't very interested in them. Most of my friends are women, and I've generally been more comfortable around women. My idea of a companionable male relationship is sort of sitting down in silence and really not acknowledging one another. But our first son is on the spectrum, and so that's, I mean, anyone who's been through that process, that's quite a confronting and transformative thing. He's a wonderful kid, but we didn't know how he would go early on. It could have been a severe version. As it turns out, is high, what they call high functioning. But there are definite social differences, and there are things that he does that are registered that can be registered as sort of threatening or aggressive, even though they're just sort of instinctive
Like
behaviours. So if he's really enjoying your company or excited by you, he'll be this far away from your face.
Right.
Yeah. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable with their personal space being invaded in that way. And I've seen lots of men who are like that, by the way. And I have started to read them through that prism. Stuff to do with social cues, just not picking up. And so I've had to take on the role of, someone who personally I've never felt very socially competent. I've had to show him some things about being socially competent. And that has definitely sensitized me to the fact that boys can relate differently to each other and to the world. And I think there is a kind of spectrum of behaviour. And because my son is one of a group of boys, I see other boys, and I see the different way. I see how physical they can be, how when they're emotional it can become aggressive. I just think, and so those vulnerabilities of boys, I think, aren't foregrounded very much.
That's really powerful, though, what you just said about social skills, because a lot of the trolls, quite a couple of them said to me, I don't have the social skills I need. And they know that. They're incredibly bright, but they've kind of got this deficit there, which I think carries with... And my father was from a very working class family, and I remember him saying that to me as well. Like when he tried to become middle class, he had a deficit of social skills that he was always trying to catch up with.
Yeah.
And I don't think he ever felt like he got them.
So the lucky ones, like me, make up for it with competence in certain fields. And then I can talk to anyone about specific things, but with a general conversation, if we just meet over at dinner and we have to make small talk, I want to die.
You're going to be awkward.
I've got nothing to contribute. But if we can talk about a subject and there's, then I'm happy.
But I wonder how much that contributes to, you saying your cohort, they all fell away.
Yeah.
Like if they had those social skills and they were taught those social norms, maybe they would have had a different journey.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that should be taught more often. And not just taught, but just an awareness of the incredible diversity, not just between boys and girls or whatever, just between people. That people experience the world in different ways, and that has an impact on how they engage with one another.
We are going to take some questions from you. The text line, I think, is up on the screen. So if you want to send a message, we'll start taking. Thank you very much. Here's one we prepared earlier. Send us a message now. Try and keep it fairly brief if you can. And if it's for either Ginger or Shannon, maybe just indicate which one you want the question posed to. But just before we get to that, Shannon, you've talked a lot today, but you've also written about it, and we've spoken about it over the phone, about you ending up on a different path. It's clearly not just about competency, as you put it just then. Is there was there a moment, is there a person, was there an event that actually sort of put you on a different path?
No, I was just weird. I was just a little bit different. I did lots of weird and different things.
Are you just being self-effacing?
No. First of all, I guess at a young age, no one really taught me how to read, and I just started reading, and that gave me something to attach to. And so at school, I always felt really comfortable. My teachers didn't feel comfortable because I was terrible to them, and they always had high expectations for me. But I was always lucky. I always had that experience of people going, "Wow, you can do that."
Yeah.
I was deeply attached to literature, and I think that definitely helped me to explore various moral and psychological things. And so I think that was huge for me. But otherwise, I was just very weird. I was a vegetarian, like the only vegetarian I knew when I was a teenager. I was like a weird Buddhist guy for a while, and I just seemed to shift around with lots of different strange things. So that's it. I think it's just that I was weird.
I think you have started there to answer one of the questions that we've got for you. And by the way, if you're sending messages in, please put your name, just so these guys know who they're answering. How did you learn the linguistic skills to express what you were feeling?
Oh, I think literature again. I think that that gives you all of that. That's a simple answer. I think. Yeah.
So this question has just come in. Why do you think the marginalisation of these lost boys so regularly manifests itself as hatred directed towards other marginalised groups as opposed to more powerful men?
So it has a name that actually it's called lateral violence. And what predator trolls do is they police discourse with themselves at the centre. So they have this idea that white men should be at the top of the tree and everybody else is taking away that privilege and that power. They wouldn't express it like that, but that's why they will attack anybody that isn't them. So they attack black people, fat people, rape victims, LGBTI people, anybody who they see as having a vulnerability, because to them it's like a pie. They particularly hate white women, so I was like, they're absolute hate match. And I had these arguments with them. I was like, it's not a pie, dude. Like, if I get some of the pie, you don't get less pie. But they think it is a pie.
That lateral violence thing is interesting. I was reading a great book called White Trash, A History of Class in America. And I can't remember the author's name, but she talks about what happened during that period of slavery in the South, where you would have the very poor whites being contemptuous of the black slaves, but then also the black slaves pointing over at those hopeless poor whites and being contemptuous of them, feeling that they were more civilized. And it's one of the things that I find really sad, but it does seem to be compulsive. My instinct would be to combine all of the poor people into a group that should be able to collaborate and feel more for each other than for other people. But that fragmenting seems to happen fairly compulsively.
And we're talking about gang behaviour in the green room. So one of the people I've interviewed in my book is Dr. Clark Jones, who is he's an expert in radicalisation, but he's also an expert in gang behaviour. And he was talking about if you feel really weak, you want a cohort. And so we see this in all different kinds of gangs, predator trolls, bikie gangs, jihadis. It's a very common behaviour. So they feel strong and they sort of reinforce each other's beliefs. And they are strong together. That's why there's so many dead people in my book.
We're getting quite a few questions on this one particular theme or notion. I'm going to put two of these questions together.
Okay.
Melody says this: I'm a nurse at Risdon Prison. I work primarily with max and medium security. Everything that you are both saying today relates to 98% of the boys in there, especially emotional neglect when a child. Currently, I can't see any progress with rehabilitation in the prison. Any suggestions? And Miriam has asked this, along with a few other people. Should empathy or radical empathy be taught in schools?
I mean, I almost feel like there's a empathy deficit in society at the moment, and we're getting angrier and angrier. So, I mean, I need to be clear about radical empathy. It's not about necessarily taking on the other person's viewpoint, but it's just about listening and being open-hearted to that. And I think every kid should be taught that. I'm always talking to my children about, you've got to be kind. Like, we've got to make the community better. You know, when Jacinta Ardern came out at the United Nations, it was kind of amazing because Donald Trump was talking about, protectionism and all kinds of other things. And she just came out and said, we all need to be kinder. And it was kind of profound. But prisons are really hard. I've spent a lot of time reporting in prisons, and it does sometimes feel intractable. The most incredible thing I've ever seen in a prison was when they very first opened up Port Phillip Prison in Victoria. It's a private prison. Everyone was committing suicide, and there were riots, and it was just a disaster. And all the young men that were in there were getting spat out as much more violent criminals, which is really common. And this one prison guard, I remember her because her name was Anne Hooker, which is a bizarre name, and she decided to create this youth unit in the prison, and it was a revelation. And all the young men went in there. They had to have mentors. They had 24 hours support. They had to work, and they had to do all these anger management courses, and they had to get an education. And, one of those young men said to me, this amazing thing happened in here. I realised that you don't have to punch someone in the face when you disagree with them. And he had gotten a TAFE certificate, and he was on his way out, and I had the feeling like, he's going to be okay. So yeah, I think we need a radically different approach to prisons, and probably empathy is part of that, and treating those people like humans.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that, although I know I met a lot of people who didn't seem like they could be rehabilitated, and so I'm sort of a foot on each side of the fence with that.
Do you think actually some tough love and discipline is useful?
Well, in certain, I don't know. It's too general. Like it depends on very specific cases. Like as a parent, when some form of tough love is appropriate because you're responding to the immediate thing at hand. There should probably be a sort of broader range of possibilities when it comes to punishment, discipline.
It sounds like nuance.
Yes.
Nuance, but also like someone like Mark, you are never going to rehabilitate him. You do not get the happy story where I talk to him for 5 years and he turns out okay. He will never turn out okay. He's a psychopath.
There's another question in saying there's been a lot of talk about radical empathy as well as the role of women in saving, in inverted commas, lost boys. What role do you see for men in practically contributing to troubled men's rehabilitation? Shannon, do you want to go first?
I think that's a question for you.
I guess it's just about engagement. I think it would be a terrible thing for a young man to make all of the stupid mistakes that young men will make, and to not have a sort of older mentor figure or someone who they respect tell them when they're being incredibly stupid, when they're impoverishing themselves. And that can be in relation to women, in relation to any kind of, their career or whatever. And maybe there's a gap there.
But I have a really conflicting opinion about this because I think fathers are really important, and a lot of young men don't have them, and you get them in Risdon Prison. But I know that those young men that spoke to me, despite me being their hate match in terms of being a woman and being Jewish, being in a mixed-race marriage and being white, they say white women are cancer, like I was, all the things, a journalist, they hate journalists. Like, they wouldn't have spoken to you or you in the way they spoke to me. They wouldn't have been telling a man about their mother or what it was like to be beaten up as a kid, or their desperate loneliness, or any of the things that came out. So, I mean, maybe that's cultural, but it's still, the fact I was a woman, even though I was their exact sort of the person they hate, it was a big thing. Gender was a big thing. I don't think women should have to save men, but I also have to acknowledge that that was a reality in that situation.
So on that, there's a question asked saying, as a young woman, I feel really conflicted between feeling empathetic towards and wanting to help the lost boys and feeling targeted, hated and threatened by them too. How do I reconcile that? Should I even try?
Look, I was a mental case by the time I finished my book. I had PTSD and depression, was drinking every day. And I have done a specialised course in therapy for trauma in journalism because it's so hard to be so close to such toxicity and absorbing it all the time and come out okay. So I don't really have an answer to that. I don't think I can tell you how to feel, but I do know that as a whole, those men need support and compassion, because if we don't give it to them in some form, we are paying a huge price for it. The Christchurch killer was this exact guy. He was unparented, he was on the internet all the time, and he went into a mosque and killed 50 people. That's a huge price to pay for not being compassionate and not giving him the love and support he needed as a kid.
Shannon?
Look, I think that the problem with those types of men is that they're probably isolated from people who would influence them.
Yeah.
In my experience, men do control that kind of behaviour in groups. So attacking women in the way that you've described is not a way to gain the respect of your male peers in most functional male groups. And I think that maybe one of the unfortunate things about the way that men interact with each other is we do tend to exclude those guys who seem a bit crazy. And we do it harshly. So I don't know. It's probably the case that someone needs to intervene at some point.
They're very isolated, though. That's not quite true what you're saying, though. Like, okay, most guys are not incels, but you very often see a group of men and one of them will say something foul to a woman, like that's, on the verge of being okay, and the mates won't step in and say, don't say anything about her tits, please. She's just walking past. I've done a lot of work with Our Watch that tries to get the media to deal better with domestic violence, and a lot of it's about gendered stereotypes. So the gendered stereotypes and the violence that the incels are using is in our community, even on in male groups, you hear it. Like, you just need to go to the football, you hear it. This kind of dialogue about women.
Yeah, I don't, in my experience, it's not quite as pervasive.
But you're saying men don't get respect from each other from doing it?
Yeah, I would say that might be tolerated, but they're not high in status in those groups.
We are coming towards the end, so I think one final question. I'm going to do this one because there's a few versions of the same question. This one's a little more specific. It says, I've read a great book about using Greek tragedies to teach and help lost boys, soldiers, prisoners, prison guards, verbalise their emotions. Do you think literature could be the best way to reduce radicalisation? Shannon?
The great thing about Greek tragedy, or maybe the unsettling thing about Greek tragedy, is it comes from a very pessimistic tradition where tragedy is a fact of life and you don't get to escape it, you just have to endure it. And I think that tradition works well in that context, and that can be a good way of sorting through those issues. But it depends on the kind of thing that you're reading.
Literature as a tool here, what do you think?
Thank you for all the great questions. They're amazing. Look, there's a lot of research to show that if you read a lot of literature, you are more empathetic because you're open to all these different kinds of worlds and emotions that you might not have experienced yourself. So it's actually not theoretical. It's backed up with scientific research that is the case. So yes, prison libraries.
But as you know, there are two kinds of empathy.
There's two kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Yeah.
And what they are is cognitive empathy is where I can understand your emotions, but affective empathy is where I feel for you. So the research is that trolls have cognitive empathy, so they know how you're going to respond, they know how to attack you, but they do not feel for you, which is terrifying. So you get someone like Mark who can tell how to incite someone to suicide but has no moral qualms about that whatsoever.
So I think that literature can feed cognitive empathy as much as it feeds affective empathy. So
Yeah,
what I would say
okay.
is that literature can make you better at being cruel.
as well.
It's interesting.
That's
Yeah.
a hopeful note to end on. Would you please put your hands together for Ginger Gorman and Shannon Burns?
Thank you as well, and thank you, Hamish. I'm going to be Thank you.
Really nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.